This is TJ with Tech Made Easy. Welcome to the channel. And my channel is all about making things affordable, practical, and easy. And today we're going to talk about my journey into getting into Linux and why, after 30 plus years of using Windows, that I went to Linux. So let me just start off saying that I first started with the Linux Mint Cinnamon, and then later on down the road, I went ahead and looked at a whole bunch of other distributions, put them on thumb drives, kind of did a tour with them, and then and the reason why I was doing that is I noticed that Linux Mint Cinnamon, the desktop seemed a little laggy to me. I liked the desktop, but it just seemed a little laggy to me. And then I just discovered I didn't realize that these different distros have different desktop versions, and so I discovered that Linux Mint had XFCE, and I tried that and I really liked it. It seemed more snappier, and then of course later I found out that it's lighter on the system and so on and so forth. And that's what I've been using since. There was a point after, maybe a year or more after using Linux Mint, that I decided to check out the distros again. And I really did like some of the features of KDE. The Plasma desktop, and I tried different distros with that desktop as well. I wanted to see if there's really some who say they're better for gaming. I found that out. I don't, and this is just me personally, I don't think those ones say that they're better for gaming do gaming any better than just a regular Linux distro. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe that's just me. I'm not a big gamer, but I was looking for stuff that my kids could get away from Windows and start gaming on Linux. And so I do use two computers, so I put KDE Neon Plasma on my second computer. I don't use that one as much, so I thought, oh, I'll just play around with it. And yeah, I thought it was a little quirky. There's things that I like to do in Linux Mint that were a little harder to do in KDE Plasma, and so anyway, I went back to Linux Mint. But I just want to explain my journey real quick and some frustrations, pros and cons of going from Windows to Linux, especially being a Windows user for so long. And everybody has the kind of user you are in Windows is going to differ. My experience running Windows is different from somebody else. I mean, I have a home network. I used to have a home business in my house as well, so networking was a big deal. I used to be in IT 20 years ago and have a video server, and so networking was a big deal to me. And I'll show you some quirky things that I discovered at first. But so I just want to share, like, what were my frustrations? What are the pros and cons? How did I overcome those frustrations? Because there's a lot of things that people don't tell you when you go from Windows to Linux. You expect some of the apps and programs to work just like Linux, and they don't, but it doesn't mean that you can't find a comparable app for that. Little things like the image viewer in Linux, they're really basic, or in Windows you can, and this is the thing that I wanted to talk about. A lot of people that demo Linux, they talk about, well, now you got to use GIMP. Well, GIMP is like Photoshop, and a lot of people don't use Photoshop. When I manipulate a photo, I just want to change maybe the lighting, the color, the hue, and I want a simple interface for that. Well, GIMP is not a simple interface. And so I discovered, and I'm actually gonna make another video of a journey of the apps that I found that were easy to use, similar to some of the ones in Windows. I'm not saying that all the apps in Windows are great, but they do have some that are really convenient to use, especially if you just want to manipulate a photo really quick. Their built-in photo editor is pretty good just for editing a photo. But anyway, so my big deal was I have some friends that are Linux IT guys, and they really like Linux Mint. They says, hey, just go to Linux Mint. It's great for new users and everything. And I no. I have too many Windows apps. I don't want to give up my Windows apps. And along the way, I I started. Um, I don't know. Maybe I could say I started getting bored of Windows, and then what I started doing, I really did want to try Linux though, and so I started finding apps that were that I could use on Linux and on Windows. So when I made that jump to Linux, it wasn't as painful. And the first one I found was obviously LibreOffice, because I needed something other than Microsoft Office. And I'm not a big, I don't do heavy spreadsheeting, huge documents or anything like that. But I still need a spreadsheet. I still need a document. I don't have to, or a document writer like Word. And I don't get a lot of I don't get a lot of Word documents anyway, and so it's like, well, it's no big deal as long as I can do some make up a document, and the fact that you can save it as a Word document is great. You can save the Libra spreadsheet as an Excel spreadsheet is great, and I do use the presentation software sometimes, so that was great. So I just started looking at stuff that when I made the transfer, it would be easier. And I didn't know about my video editing because I've always created videos for the family and everything like that. And I really love my video editor, and I'll talk about that when we get more into this. And so eventually I made the move to Linux Mint. And like I said, when I first made that, I thought Cinnamon, there was just something about Cinnamon that was a little clunky to me. It didn't react very fast, and I really have I just love XFCE, and I know that some people, poo-hoo that, but and just if you're not a Linux person, let me explain something about XFCE. The default system is really basic, but you have these distros that go in and they modify it and make it really user-friendly, really nice. And that's what Linux Mint has done. They made it look like Cinnamon. So we'll get on the desktop, and we'll talk also about the pros and cons of using Linux as a daily driver. And then we'll just maybe discuss like who is Linux for? What user is it for? And that is kind of a wide range, open question. There are going to be some people Linux is not going to be for them. They're going to always want to stick with Windows, stay with Windows. And I'm not saying everybody should go to Linux either. And so let's get on the desktop and we can discuss some of that as well while we look at some of these pros and cons and show you some of the things that were frustrating to me at first that I worked through to start to enjoy Linux. Okay, really quick, I'm going to go over Linux distros for a minute, and this isn't going to be a complete thing on Linux distros, but there's Linux Mint. You may have heard these: KDE Plasma, Ubuntu, Fedora, Manjaro. The reason why I'm going over these is because these distros can be pros and cons to Linux, and so let's just talk about distros for a minute. So a distro or a Linux desktop is made of two parts. One is the Linux operating system itself. Some people call it the kernel, but that's where everything is command driven. It's all text based. Then on top of that, you have the GUI interface that the distro started putting on top of that command based operating system. And there's lots of GUI interfaces to choose from. So just like 30 years ago, you had DOS. Well, DOS was an operating system, and you had Windows, and Windows was just a GUI interface that ran on top of DOS. Then in 1995, they kind of combined it, and when you installed Windows 95, it installed the DOS. It basically restructured it, and so now you have you didn't have to install DOS anymore. It all installed in one thing, and Windows became the operating system. But underlying Windows is still the DOS interface. It's changed over time. So Linux basically has three main interfaces, and just they're like 30 years ago, or not interfaces, excuse me, three main Linux operating systems. Just like 30 years ago, there was, and there might have been more than these two, but there was
MS-DOS and DR-DOS or Dr. DOS, and you could run the Windows GUI interface on either one of those. So what we have today with Linux is the most popular main operating system out there is a Debian, Fedora, and Arch. But the commands, not all of the commands, but some of the commands between those operating systems are different, and the commands for installing apps are different. So you have to be aware of that when you go to those. You can't just go from Debian to Arch and use all of the same commands. Some of the commands differ as you go to different Linux operating systems. And then you have the GUI interface, and there's a lot of GUI interfaces that you can put on top of these. And not only can you put these GUI interfaces on, but you can modify those GUI interfaces to give your distro a different look than somebody else's. So I have Ubuntu down there because Ubuntu was basically one of the first ones to create a GUI interface for Linux. And one of the pros and cons to all of these distros is that's the problem. There's a lot of distros, and when you're a new user coming from Windows to Linux, you don't understand, because you're used to Windows, and Mac is the same way. One company creates one interface and that's all you have. But with Linux, because it's open source and nobody really owns it, you have all these different distros with all these different GUI interfaces. But that's also the pro, because then you can choose a distro that you like that suits your needs better than others. And if you're really a Linux guru, then you could just do everything from the ground up. But I'm not that kind of a guru. I choose a distro that fits me the best. So let's take a look here. KDE is a really popular GUI interface. KDE itself also offers their own Linux distro, but then a lot of people use KDE's desktop over their distros. And so then you have Ubuntu, and Ubuntu, I'm not an Ubuntu, I don't like this interface of Ubuntu, and they do have other interfaces or GUI interfaces, but this is their main flagship one. But you have Ubuntu, you have Elementary OS, gives you kind of a Mac-like interface, and then of course Linux Mint, which I use. Now, one thing I don't like about Linux Mint, I don't like the look of it right out of the box. I don't like this. I don't like the grayish black background, and the icons are. They've changed the icons now to kind of a yellowish color, but they used to be green. I didn't like that green, and I think the reason why is because it was called Linux Mint. But even Linux Mint comes in Cinnamon, Mate, and XFCE, which I use. And here's my Linux Mint desktop. I've gone ahead and all I've done is change the background, change the color of the icons and the style of the icons, and I've modified my toolbar just a little bit. And all these things are easy to do in Linux. One thing that did really intimidate me with Linux, the reason why I didn't go to Linux, because I always thought that it was really command driven. And you're going to see as I go further into this that you don't even have to touch the command line. Very rarely do you have to touch it. Sometimes you do, but very rarely. Let's jump on the Linux desktop, and before we do that, I do have to apologize ahead of time. When I am going to be running, so I can demo a few things. I am running Linux Mint in a virtual machine, and for some reason when my card records it, it's not very clear. It's clear on the screen, but I don't know why it does that. So I apologize for it not being as clear as it could be. But let's just jump on the desktop, and I want to show you some other things that frustrated me at first when I was a user, what I had to get over. So let's jump on the desktop. Okay, so here we are at Linux Mint desktop. Obviously this isn't the one that I showed you at the beginning. That's my personal desktop. This is just one for demoing purposes for the video. But what I want to show you here, there's a lot of customizing you can do with the desktop, and depending on if you're running KDE or some of the others, depends on how much customizing you can do. But just little things here, like if I go into panel preferences, I have a 43-inch monitor and it's just too wide, so I'll shorten the toolbar here so that the start menu is way closer to me, and then I'll make these icons a little bigger, and it just makes it more convenient. So what I really want to show you here is one of the things that really frustrated me when I first, because I was used to Windows and how networking works in Windows, and I personally have a home network. We have our personal files on a file server, and then we have a separate file server for our videos. And so anyway, so when I hit browse network, here's my video file, and we'll just log in to this, and if I put my password in here, and if I say remember forever, connect, password in. Okay, see how it's telling me to authenticate? Now, when I go to reboot, in Windows, if you tell it to remember your credentials, it remembers it when you reboot. You don't have to log in again. But with Linux, you have to log in every time. You don't have, you aren't given to that one login screen. You're just given to a password screen. And I didn't really like that. And there's another problem with that too that I'll talk about. So I'm going to go over here, and these, and I need to back up just for a minute here because I forgot to explain why I have these both here. Linux has file managers, and they have multiple file managers. They don't just use one, and some have different features than others. And the one that comes with Linux Mint is the Thunar one, and I'm not a fan of the Thunar one. And this is the Thunar one right here where my mouse cursor is, on the left. The Nemo one is on the right. The Nemo one to me is more robust and more user-friendly. When I say user-friendly, they're both user-friendly, but this one gives you more options and features. And so I'm going to go over to this one because I want to show you something really quick. I'm going to go over to the server we just logged into, and I'm going to create a shortcut for this test folder. And I'm just going to drag this back down underneath these two right here. If I was to reboot this computer, and I think there's only one file in here. There isn't very much in here. So if I was to reboot this computer, I would not have access to this folder until I put in my password. And that's just, I didn't really like that because you don't have to do that with Windows. And I'm really big on shortcuts, especially creating shortcuts to a certain section on my server. And so I didn't really like that. Now there is another way to do a network drive that isn't what we just did here. These are basically browsing. I want to say soft mounts. So in Windows, when we create a drive, it'll be a letter. It's not a letter in Linux, and I had to get used to that as well. They call it mounting. In Windows, it's really mounting too. You just don't know that that's what it's really called. In Linux, there's two ways to mount a network drive. One is what I call a soft mount, and this is one I call a soft mount right here. The reason why I call it a soft mount because when I reboot, I still have to put in my password to get into it. Once I have my password into it, then I'm fine. That's just right when I reboot. Now, but if I want to not have to do that and have access to that, there's a config file called the fstab, and and I'm not going to show you the command line for that. You put it in there, and then that'll make it a hard mount. And when I say a hard mount, this is what I call it. I don't know what they call it in Linux terms. It will just automatically mount for you with the password and everything, and you can just click on the icon and you're in it. You don't have to put your password in for the first time after you mount it. And getting used to mounts was something that was a challenge for me, because I wasn't used to the term. Just wasn't used to doing that. So that was a little frustrating for me at first, but I got over it. Let's talk about shortcuts for a minute. Now, if you're a Windows user, maybe you use shortcuts, maybe you don't. I use shortcuts a lot. Especially I like to put shortcuts to my server and certain directories on my server. And so when I got Linux, I didn't know what a shortcut was. they don't call them shortcuts, they call them links, and the symbolic link really is what it's called. But if I go on here and I say create link, it'll create this link right here. I can just put this out, have access to it, just like in Windows, okay? But in Nemo here, which is my favorite file browser, if I was to right mouse click on this, there is no create link. Why? Why is there no create link, man? It's like, come on. Now I learned I did learn the keyboard. Now I did learn the keyboard commands to do a symbolic link, so it's not that big a deal anymore. So if I want to create a link with Nemo, I just do Shift Control and drag it out, and it'll create that link right here. And here's our link here. I guess we can pull this one down here. That was something that frustrated me at first. Obviously I got over it. But now this is another thing that's frustrating. Let's go back onto my file server. Let's say I want to make a shortcut here. Create link. Yeah, it didn't create it. If I use my key command, now it created it. I don't know why, but within the server, it doesn't always create the shortcut when you say create link. So it's really weird. Sometimes I haven't with this file manager, the Thunar one, I can't even use the keystroke and pull this out. Okay, so to be fair to Nemo, but I didn't know this when I first started using it. And again, these are just little things, but coming from Windows, it was just a little frustrating. But if you go into Preferences, and if you go into the menus, Make Link is right here. So now when I go in to create a shortcut or a link, it's right here, and it makes that. But you know, and maybe symbolic links or shortcuts aren't that big a deal in Linux, and that's why it's not an option that's already in the pull-down menu. But from a window person, and I don't know how many window persons use shortcuts, that was just me. So that was just, again, just a small thing that was really frustrating. I don't know why they just didn't include it in the menu, why you have to go select it in the menu. But that being said, there are lots of reasons why I like Nemo, and I'm not concentrating on that. I think I'm going to make a video that goes over some of these things in more detail, and some of the things that can make your life a little bit easier in Linux. Some apps that you need to get, or just understanding how things work. It just would have been nice if they would have included that in the menu without selecting it in the preference. Those are just quirky things for me. Now, of course, obviously I got over it, and it took me I didn't know at first that the file managers, there were different file managers, and once I found out that there were different file managers, I went and looked at all of them, and Nemo is the one that fit me the best, because I have a video server and I'm constantly ripping videos, and so I'm constantly having to change the names of folders and files. And so what happens here is if I double click in this like it is in Windows, now I can rename this to test. I'll just put test 5. But over here in Thunar, you cannot double click on a text to change it. Now the keystroke for that is F2, and now you can. So an F2 is the same one in Windows. But why don't they make these things consistent? Now in Nemo, that is not the default. The double click to edit text is on a file or a folder is not the default. You have to go in Preferences and you have to click that preference, which is fine. I don't mind doing that. But why does one file manager do it when the other one doesn't? And that's the whole thing about Linux, is that you have different people creating different things and there's no standard. I mean, it's not a huge deal with me, but it does make it, when you're first starting out, a little inconvenient. And I know these are small things, but when you're used to these things just working in Windows, and then you have to figure out how they work in Linux, and it's a little pet peeve of mine, and it's not a big deal to me anymore. but it was at first, just because Linux was so new to me. Okay, so that's just a few. I've got the file manager, and then you just shortcuts and the way networking works. I mean, I got over it. I'm actually glad I found Nemo, because it really does make a difference for me. I really like it a lot, and I can just tell it to do this small icons here, like in Windows, and you can do the same thing here, but you got to go through the pull down menu. And that's the thing about Linux. If there's something that you're using that you're missing a feature, you might be able to find it in something else. So even the picture viewer, that's the default one, I don't like that one, but Linux Mint comes with another one, so I made that my default picture viewer. Okay, like I said at the beginning, one of the things that I was resisting Linux for is the command line. I didn't want it to live on the command line, and I thought you had to live on the command line in Linux. I thought every app you installed was from the command line. Well, when I saw that demo on Linux Mint, I didn't realize that they were Linux store managers. And so that's what I want to talk about really quick now, is let's go into the Linux store manager real quick. Now one thing you got to realize, and I might have mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but a lot of the third-party apps that people use are actually on all three platforms, Windows, Mac, and Linux. And one of those apps, and I'm just going to make this just a little bit bigger, and let's just go ahead and put in Zoom. There's Zoom. You'd be surprised how many apps you use on Windows that are actually available in Linux. And I'm going to just put in Spotify here for a minute. And I do want to talk to you about Spotify. You're going to notice here that there's two Spotifys here. And the reason why there's two Spotifys is Linux created what they call flat packs. I don't know how many years ago it's existed, but flat packs are a little more secure. And if you remember, I talked about that there are different Linux operating systems like Arch and Debian and Fedora. They keep all of their software in a repository, and there's a separate repository for Arch, a separate repository for Debian, and even your distros have their own repositories. So what it is, if you install an app on Arch, it has to come from the Arch repository. But if you use a Flatpak, the Flatpak can be installed on Arch, any of them. It doesn't matter. It's not relying on the Arch repository, and so that's why Flatpaks have become really popular. They're kind of independent of which Linux operating system you're running, and they're actually a little bit more secure. They take up a little bit more room. But I don't want to get into all the minutiae of Flatpaks. You have snaps on the Ubuntu side. Some Linux people don't like snaps because they launch slower. They maybe work a little slower. They're trying to fix that. It's canonical. Some people don't like canonical because canonical you can't just create a snap pack and put it over there on canonical. They control all that. Flatpak isn't that way. And I personally, whenever I can, I always install a Flatpak. And so I can't always install one. Sometimes you just have to install it from the regular repository, which is fine. But that's kind of the difference there. But I just wanted to show you a couple other things here. Like if we go VLC, oops, let's type it in right. So if we type in VLC, again, we're going to have a Flatpak version and the regular version, but again, download. Oh, and this is the thing about the Flatpak versions. They're usually more up to date than the regular repository versions, and that's another reason why to use them. But if you want, say, OSB, so and if an app isn't on here that you're using, then maybe you can find one that is like that app. At any rate, there's a lot of flexibility with the apps that you have there. And I'm going to talk about what if there isn't a window app that you really want to use. but it's not available on Linux. I'm going to address that towards the end of the presentation. Okay, one thing I need to point out here, just because there's a software that you're looking for in Linux isn't in the software manager, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Not every single piece of software is going to be in the software manager. So you might have to Google that, or you might have, and you may have to go to a website that offers a Linux version of the software that you're looking for. But just so you know, not everything, just because you can't find it in the software manager doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Okay, so that was just, I was showing some of the small frustrations I had. Obviously, I worked through those. I figured them out. But just to let you know, if you're thinking about going to Linux, just understand you're going to have some frustration at first. And don't get me wrong, I have seen people on YouTube try Linux for a month and totally give up. In fact, let me talk about Linus Tech Tips. So Linus and Luke, they wanted to see if they could make Linux their daily driver and still game on Linux. And if you've seen those episodes, Linus first tried Pop! OS and had problems when he went to install Steam. It was a new version, and they didn't realize there was going to be a hiccup with that version in Steam. And so then Linus made even a worse mistake and tried. I guess he had heard that Manjaro was really popular, but there's no way, if you're a new user, would have you go to Manjaro. Now, Manjaro was one of the easier Arch-based Linux distros to use, but still, you can have a lot of problems. And if you don't know Linux, you're not going to be able to solve those. And he ran into all kinds of problems trying to get his gaming working on Manjaro. And this brings up another, and Luke actually did Linux Mint. Luke actually fared out a lot better than Linus did. Linux Mint, and this is the whole thing. When you go try to choose a distro, and you're going to go try Linux, stick to a Debian-based distro. Now, when I say Debian, if you go with Ubuntu, Ubuntu is still a Debian-based distro. Linux Mint uses the base of Ubuntu, but again, Ubuntu is based on Debian. So you just want to make sure the commands, there's a lot of help on using Debian, a lot of commands that you can use out there if you need to find something. I just would not suggest someone, even no matter how user-friendly an Arch distro is, I wouldn't suggest a new user go to Arch for the very first experience. There might be some Linux people out there that disagree with that. There are some Linux people out there that do disagree with it. So just be aware of that. And also be aware, if you're going to go to Linux, you may want to check all of your peripherals in your computer and make sure everything is compatible with Linux. And Linux also actually works a little different because most of the drivers are built into the operating system, into what they call the kernel. And so you may have something new enough that isn't in the kernel yet, but it may have a driver for Linux. So it's not that you can't use it, but you do have to kind of look at what you're bringing over to Linux to make sure it's all compatible, because not everything is. The second point I want to make is, who is Linux for? That's a wide, broad question, because one person may be for Linux, and that exact same person may not be for Linux. So it just depends on your needs. It depends on what apps you're using. And what I do want to talk about Windows apps for a minute. So if you are running proprietary Windows software that's not available on Linux, you have to really think through whether you want to go to Linux or not. Or one of the things that you can do, I don't like some of these options, but they are options and people do them, especially people that do gaming. They will dual boot. So they'll install Linux and so what'll happen is when their computer comes up, it'll ask them, do you want to boot into Linux or boot into Windows? The problem is with dual booting that I don't like, and dual booting's been around for a long time, that dual boot can get corrupted. Once it's corrupted, you don't have access to any operating system. So be careful if you're going to do a dual boot. The preferred way that I would do it at first is I would have a second hard drive that I would install Linux on, and then through my computer's BIOS at boot up, I would choose to boot either to Windows or to Linux that way. It's a safer way to do it. That's another option. There is another option. Some Windows apps will run in what they call Wine, but some won't. And so, yeah, the one Windows program I wanted to use that I didn't want to give up would not run in Wine. So that's why I used two PCs for a long time. And the only reason, or not the only reason, the only time I used my Windows PC was when I wanted to use my video editing software. And so it wasn't until recently, maybe the last couple of months, that I finally have been able to use my video editing software in Linux. Let me explain. So there's what's called virtual machines. Now, those of you that are familiar with virtual machines know that things don't run as fast in a virtual machine, especially the graphics, your GUI interface. What some people do is they will do a GPU pass-through where you're passing your GPU through to Linux. So now Linux now has your 100% of your GPU, but you can't run Linux at the same time. As soon as you exit out of Windows, then Linux comes back up. Or if you have two video cards, then you can. I don't have enough room for two video cards because I have other peripherals that are plugged into my slots that don't allow me to have two video cards. So I was kind of in a conundrum. What do I do here? I want to be on Linux only. I don't want to switch to my Windows machine. Well, I finally found a VM that runs Windows almost 100% native without GPU pass-through. And that's what I do now, is I use that program. I use that VM, and I'm going to make a video on this VM because it's awesome. So that's how I get around that now. I tried VMs before to do my video editing with, but it didn't work. But this VM is great, and it's not QEM. It's not some of the ones you know out there. It's one I'd never heard of. Anyway, video upcoming on that. So gaming on Linux. Oh man. There's a lot of Linux gamers, but you have to research on, if you are going to move to Linux, do a research on whether your games run on Linux or not. A lot of games run on Linux now, a lot. Not all of them run though. And one thing I will say, and I don't know if the comments will explode on this, but you have a lot of Linux users that are gaming and they say that their games run better on Linux. Now, I don't know what games they're playing, so I can't comment on that. But I do some gaming testing on Windows on some of my videos. And I always use the built-in benches for that. And I've tried it on Linux. I have not seen those games run more efficient in Linux than Windows. In fact, they lose some frames per second by running it in. You can still play it in Linux, but it's not getting the same or better performance in Linux as it is in Windows. So that's all I'm going to say there. Now, our kids game, and I would love them to be on Linux, but they also have the Xbox Game Pass. And so that's kind of hinders me on having them game on Linux. Now, if you paid for the Game Pass where it's cloud gaming, that's an option right there. And that's how some Linux users get around that. They might have the Xbox cloud gaming and are gaming on the cloud. So gaming, again, that's going to be up to you. You got to do your research on that. But back to who is Linux for, it all depends on the person really and what their needs are. If all you need is to search the web, use a spreadsheet, a word processor every now and then, man, why not use Linux? It's going to run better. You can run it on older equipment, and that's the one thing I do want to talk about. One thing I refuse to do is upgrade my equipment so I can run Windows 11. I do not plan on running Windows 11. Now, I may have to do that with my kids, but I'm not going to upgrade theirs either. There is a way around of installing Windows 11 on equipment that really doesn't qualify for it. But my computers are great. They're powerful. I'm not going to upgrade just so I can run Windows 11. There are options there. But so you really have to decide and what it's worth it to you to run. And so I can't really say who Linux is for because that's a really broad statement. But I will say, if you're the type of person, that's you're mostly on the web most of the time, doing social media, whatever. Even if you're doing video editing, because you can video edit on, and you're not stuck on what you video edit on, then by all means go to Linux. And one thing I will say about Windows, even though you pay for a license, you don't own Windows. That license is basically almost a rental license, so that you can run Windows. It does not mean you own Windows. In Linux, I want to say 98% of everything is free, including the operating system, the distros, the apps that you use. There are some proprietary operating systems that you do pay money for, or apps and operating systems, but there's not very many that are like that. And a lot of times, if you're paying for the operating system, you're paying for support. That's what you're paying for. Distros, which one to start with? Like I said, I would stick to a Debian-based distro. You might want to check out KDE Plasma. A lot of the distros use KDE Plasma for their GUI. Me personally, I have tried it. I think it's a little quirky, so I don't use it. And then even for me, I started out with Linux Mint Cinnamon, and then I went to Linux Mint XSFCE, which I really do like. And just within the last 9 months, I went through another distro. I didn't distro hop, I just researched the distros, and I have extra computers I can install them on and try them that way, laptop. And I do use 2 computers, and so I thought my second computer, I want something different this time. So I'm gonna use a distro that has KDE on it. There's just some quirky things I didn't like about it, so I have Linux Mint XSVE on both of those. And I kind of recommend Linux Mint just because it has a Windows-like interface to it. And when I say Windows, more like Windows 7, so you're familiar with it. It's easy to use. It's been around for a long time. It's one of the more popular ones. And I'm not saying just because something's popular you have to use it, but it's kind of a safe way to get into Linux. Later on down the road, if you want to upgrade to something else, to another distro, or you want to try a distro with KDE Plasma on it, fine, do that as well. Just make sure it's a Debian based. I will say this much though, the reason why I like Linux Mint as well is it automatically sees what video card you have and puts the driver in. Not all of them do that. You have to install the driver separately. It doesn't mean they don't have the driver available in that, they just don't do it automatically. Anyway, so sorry about all the little rants. Even though I did rant at the beginning of this video of the frustrations, would I ever go back to Windows? No way. I love Linux now. The more I use it, the more I like it. The more I enjoy it as a desktop. So anyway, this is TG with Tech Made Easy. Thanks for coming to the channel. I know this video is a little long, but I hope it's helpful. Have a great day. Thanks.
Now that was easy peasy.